I don't know. I've always liked kind of off the wall topics. I find losers more interesting than winners. I do. I think, and you can find great stories in failure and in problems, right? I mean, when you read the paper and you want to know what's going on in the world, a lot of times the paper teaches you things that are going wrong. You know what I mean? Stuff you're reading about. I'm Gen X. I'm sarcastic and cynical, right? And so my view of history is a little bit cynical, right? I question things. I question, the book The Greatest Generation. I'm like, let's not give a title to a generation. Let's not say 50 million people are a certain way. Let's look a little deeper into that. And so, writing about the NFL, I don't want to read about the Pittsburgh Steelers, the greatness of Bill Belichick. You know what I mean? I don't want to read that. I want to read about something else, and that's why I got into Yugo, writing about the Cold War, writing about 80s culture. How could an unassuming automobile become an icon for failure? For anyone over the age of 45, you remember that. A kid parked next to me, a girl in my high school, and one day I came out and the football players had turned their car sideways in the parking lot, and I don't know why that was. So what is it about this? And it's the same thing about growing up, funny tales of Florida and weird Florida and Florida Man, the Florida Man we all laugh about, and but try to go a little deeper than that. And what was different about where I grew up? And the origin of this book, honestly, is the town over for me, which I could talk about, is Port Charlotte, is really the genesis of this book. And Port Charlotte had about 25,000 people when I was growing up in the 80s, but it had almost 200,000 80 by 125 foot lots. 200,000 lots, all connected by a paved road. A poorly paved road, right? That these developers, and I examined it and I learned how bad these roads were. Soil, ground from just the earth that they dug from ditches, mixed with cement and put down as blacktop. And as soon as they were done, they would escheat these roads to the counties. So we would all pay for these roads. You've all paid for these roads. And we would go out there and race cars, or make out, or fight, or whatever high schoolers do, right? And we didn't have any woods in Charlotte County. We had roads to nowhere. All the woods, all the open spaces in Charlotte County were roads, were lots. And I thought that was the weirdest damn thing. It was like Mad Max, beyond Thunderdome. And I've always carried that. I carry these ideas for books, and the ideas I carry are kind of a little skewed, kind of a little strange, and that's just kind of my hook to writing.
Now, there was some other people using those roads to nowhere, were there not? People with airplanes?
Yes, and I thought, okay, what he's referring to is these roads to nowhere in Cape Coral, Golden Gate Estates, Port Charlotte, Northport. I thought it was an urban legend that drug dealers would fly in Cessnas full of pot and cocaine. I always thought that was an urban legend. I got into this book, and many times I'm like, holy hell, what they were bringing in, especially the Golden Gate. Golden Gate had one, it was like, I mentioned in the book, I don't remember how much it was, but it was in the 80s, like $150 million coke seizure in one plane, right? They had a problem with people dumping bodies off of these roads, right? I joke about Northport, which is another town down there, and Northport was built in the 50s, and Sarasota never liked Northport. It was at the far end of the county. Sarasota had the money, Sarasota had the beach, and Northport was this weird development that they didn't want to ever happen. And it grew and grew and grew, and now Northport is bigger than Sarasota, which is amazing. And someone from Sarasota Magazine, a writer I don't know, wrote an article in the early 90s that Northport was the perfect place to dump a body. And people were up in arms, and so a week later he had to apologize. And I said, seemingly unaware that at that moment someone was dumping bodies in Northport. I mean, it really was. It was one of these killers that you see on TV. And these roads always captivated me, and they were full of trash. You have a bed, you don't know what to do with it, you just take it out, back into Port Charlotte and throw it. Right? I mean, that's what people did in these places. Cape Coral, the back end of Cape Coral today, Port St. Lucie today, these are two of the largest cities in Florida. Cape Coral is bigger than Fort Lauderdale. Fort Lauderdale is one of Florida's great cities, and to think that Cape Coral is bigger, and it's never going to look back. I mean, Cape Coral is bigger geographically than Boston and San Francisco combined. And it's got 120,000 lots, all zoned single-family residential. Roads to nowhere, right? Roads to nowhere that are finally getting homes, but then there's a lot of problems with that. You know, Lehigh Acres, if you look at Lehigh Acres from the air, which I've never done, but I'm just telling you to look at Google Earth, I guarantee it looks like 1,000 football fields, just put together, just cookie cuttered, gridiron of lots, and that's how it's kind of the sins of the grandfathers. You know, these lot sellers and land developers didn't really think, what about water in 2020? What about trash pickup? What about hospitals? What about schools? What if our lies come true? Right? There's a book about Cape Coral, a woman, a self-published book. It was lies that came true, or something like that. You know, tall tales and hard sales in the making of Cape Coral, Florida.
Well, now, how did these developments get started? Did it start with the Mackles doing $10 down and $10 a month, or?
Yeah, well, after World War II, Florida was really the place to be. Florida's been the place to be since before the turn of the century, right? But after World War II, we see a whole generation of GIs, just millions of GIs served here, and they wanted to go somewhere. They didn't want to go back into the cities. They didn't want to go back. Like, my father was a Korean War generation. He didn't want to go back into the mill town. He wanted to get out. People wanted to go somewhere, and these developers hit on the idea that if you, especially to retirees, this first great generation with Social Security, with big pensions, you know, relatively big pensions, but think of a Ford worker, or a bus driver, or a cop in 1955 from, you know, someone from Poughkeepsie or Albany, right? They worked hard their whole life, and now they can buy a lot in Florida for $10 down and $10 a month. $10 down and $10 a month. And so with these big land developers, the Mackle brothers were the ones I focus on. I said in the book, and I believe now, that they were straight shooters. They were honest brokers. These were rich men. They had developed Key Biscayne. They developed a number of Opelika, half of Pompano Beach. They were wealthy men. They bought up, with some other investors, 78,000 acres in 1955 in Charlotte County. 78,000 acres, an old cattle ranch that was really just denuded forest. It wasn't really a productive ranch. A rancher, had put it together through the Depression, 50 cents an acre. Land that really wasn't good for farming, that had been tapped out for turpentine. They bought up this land, and they divided it into 200,000 lots. It's right on Tamiami Trail from Charlotte Harbor and through Northport. So Port Charlotte and Northport were two sister cities. And then they cookie cuttered it. Then they sold it up north on television, radio ads. They were big spenders. Madison Avenue ad campaigns. Like, think of Mad Men. I mean, I looked at the original ads, and they were slick. They were big money ads. They spent $2 million in 7 weeks on Port Charlotte ads in 1957. $2 million. I mean, I don't know what that is today. 100 trillion. A lot of money, right? Right. A lot of money. And they, you know, you would imagine you're taking the train to work from Long Island, and you get off in the station and you see a woman in a bikini with a beach ball, and the sign says Port Charlotte, Florida, and she's selling lots. I mean, imagine the pull of that, the power of that. You know, like, I've worked 40 years here. I just want something. I want something. And these guys sold Florida, and so the Mackles, using these big ad campaigns and using, like, assembly line building techniques. You know, these weren't prefab homes; they were cinder block homes, real simple houses, cheap. Bathrooms abutted the kitchen, so there was one short pipe between them. No closet doors. Ceilings were unfinished. Jalousie windows. Right, very simple little houses. But you know, this is still nice when you're from East Pittsburgh, where my dad was from. You know, these tough towns, and you could come to Florida and start again as a retiree. And so Port Charlotte in the beginning was a Levittown. And for those of you familiar with Levittown, New York, you know, a working class, but that was a white collar. That was on Long Island for white collar workers. Port Charlotte was sold to blue collar and lower white-collar retirees with pensions. It was a Levittown for retirees. That's what Port Charlotte was. That's what Cape Coral was. That's what else? Deltona, Spring Hill, Palm Bay, Port St. Lucie, another big one. Palm Coast, which actually was ITT Levitt. Levitt Brothers built Palm Coast, and then just lots, no downtowns, not much land set aside for anything else, but just your $10 down and $10 a month ticket to Florida, and that's what it was all about, selling these communities.
Well, and they didn't just use advertising, right? They would fly people down, or they would use celebrity endorsements, that kind of thing.
Oh yeah, I like to tell people, I have a couple friends who grew up in Charlotte County that are here. If you remember what I call the worst tourist attraction in the whole world, we had it. Because Charlotte is a southwest Florida county, but we don't really have a beach. We have Inglewood. We don't have Siesta Key. You know, we had to go to other counties. We didn't Sanibel. Boca Grande is near us, and it should have been ours, but it belongs to Lee County. It's not ours. And so we had a tourist attraction, and it was in northern Port Charlotte, southern Northport on US 41, and it was just like it looked like the Brady Bunch home. It was a mid-century modern house, and it was the National Policeman's Museum and Hall of Fame. And I'm not anti-cop or anything, I don't think any of that, but as a kid, I'm like, why the hell? Who would go there? I drive by with my parents and I lived there my whole life.
Free fingerprinting.
They had a guillotine, and they had a riot gun. You could like pull the trigger, like a feedback gun, or I don't know. I'd never been in there. And I didn't know why we had it, who brought it, who went there. I never saw a car in the parking lot. It was in the middle of nowhere. Today, Port Charlotte and Northport are almost connected by sprawl. It was 10 miles in the middle of nothing. A Brady Bunch house with a guillotine in it. And what I realized was the Mackle brothers, the General Development Corporation, had built that and given it to the Policeman's Museum so they could take retiring cops there on their tours. We love policemen here. We love bus drivers here. And that's what they would do. And so imagine in 1957, you come down the Tamiami Trail. This is 100 miles south of Tampa, and there's no I-75. That's a long haul in those days, a long, dangerous haul. Car to car, right? And sometimes the road, these roads, the ditches the water would get in and ruin the road. I mean, a lot of head-on collisions in those days on that road. And you would come down, they have 3 model homes, nicer than anything you're gonna get, with all the new appliances, Westinghouse, Amana, everything's nice. A sidewalk, which you're not gonna get, right? No sidewalks. But they would build the nice little homes, and it was on Easy Street. That's what they called it, Easy Street in Port Charlotte. And then they built a 9-hole championship golf course. Championship. And then they built the Port Charlotte Beach Club. And I have to tell you that I love growing up in Charlotte County, and I love growing up in Punta Gorda, but we have a brown water brackish harbor, right? It's muddy and it's nasty on your toes, right? It's not somewhere you want to sun yourself. You boat there, you fish there, but it's not for northerners to enjoy Florida, right? And they had a beach club. I mean, it's just the worst place. I grew up there. I played sports there. I love going there, hanging out with friends, playing volleyball, whatever, but it's just a small little park in your town. But the Mackles would sell it as, imagine you're a cop. You've worked 40 years in Muncie, right? Your wife is a stay-at-home mom. Your kids are finally out of the house. It's cold. There's been strikes and union problems. Imagine all that post-World War II America. And you come to Florida for your, 2 weeks a year, and you've driven down, you got your bag of oranges. You stopped at Busch Gardens, which was, in the beginning, as you know, like 3 parakeets and a keg of beer. Like, right? I mean, it literally was. There were no rides. It was just, right? And so you come there, and there's a salesman, and they know, so where are you from? And there's an army of salesmen there. And you say, I'm from Muncie. And they find the one, all right, John, you're up. You're the Hoosier. Right? Or, so what'd you do? It's a cop. Oh, hey. And it's someone who has a background. My family police, my uncles, and they work it, like used car salesmen, right? And so they get this guy and his wife, I'm just hypothetically, and they get this guy and they take him to the beach. This is your beach club. If you buy a lot, you can use this anytime you want. He doesn't get in the water. He doesn't, it's mangrove islands. It's kind of smelly, and and then they take them over to the museum, and then they bring them back to their hotel. It's a motel, the Port Charlotte Motel, 2 stories, because there's nowhere to stay. We're 30 miles from Fort Myers. We're 40 miles from Sarasota. There's nowhere to stay. So they build a hotel, and then they have a restaurant in it. And of course, you have good liquor, steak, and you give this working man, a taste. And by the time he leaves there, he's bought 3 lots, 4 lots, whatever, and he's ready to come to Florida. And Florida is his ticket to retirement, to the golden years. And they say that Florida is a healthy environment, and you're going to live longer here. And they come up with, whatever you need to say to someone, you say it. And that's how these places worked. In Port Charlotte was one of the better ones. I write about some developments that were scams from the very beginning. Port Charlotte, no one really got ripped off. They got a $700 lot, they got a $4,000 house, and they got what they paid for it. But some places,
yeah, let's talk like the hotels where the rooms are bugged, so the salesman knew what to bring up.
Well, the worst of the big wheeler dealers, there were some that were true felons, true criminals that would disappear into the night, selling land they didn't own, true scammers. I didn't really talk about a lot of those. I talk about the big developers. And the biggest of them all were the Rosen brothers. And the Mackles were Catholics from Atlanta. Their father was a builder. They were blue bloods of Miami. They gave money to Catholic charities, Barry University, hospitals. They were friends with Nixon, right? These were esteemed guys. The Rosens were former carnival barkers from Baltimore. Step right up as kids, tough Jewish kids from a tough background. Fighters, brawlers, and they had started a business where you could pay in rates. You know what I mean? You could buy a TV and layaway, right? The term is layaway. We don't really do that anymore. And they had parlayed that into Formula Number 9. Has anyone ever heard of Formula Number 9? That's an old 50s era shampoo. I don't know how I heard of it, and most people I asked never have. I don't know how I knew about it. But Formula Number 9, and it was just hotel shampoo bought in bulk, mixed in a bathtub with lanolin. Right? And they say, you ever seen a bald sheep? Sheep's wool is lanolin. That kind of stuff. And they would just, do the mail order ads. And they pushed and pushed and pushed, and at $1 a bottle, they made a couple $1 million. I mean, these guys had made it. And Leonard Rosen, the brawler of the 2 brothers, thought to himself, hey, there's some suckers going to Florida. There's some money to be made down there. Why am I selling a $1 bottle of shampoo when I can sell a $1,000 lot? Why are we doing this? Let's get in on the action. And so they did the same thing that the Mackles did in the General Development Corporation, which built big cities, Port St. Lucie, Port Charlotte, Northport, and then Deltona as the Deltona Corporation. Spring Hill, a big Tampa suburb today, it is a suburb, even though it's 50 miles, 60 miles away. People live there. The Rosens came in right away and scoped out land, and they decided to buy this low-lying, really critically important estuary on the Caloosahatchee River, which is Cape Coral. And they dredged it and dredged it and dredged it. I mean, no environmental rules. I read somewhere that out in the middle of the Caloosahatchee is a 90-foot deep hole. And that's just, they just kept digging the river, which is usually about 10 feet deep. I mean, it's not very deep. They just dug a hole into, I don't know, China, right? And dug all the dirt they needed, and then dug a network of canals. Cape Coral has 400 and, I don't know, it's in the
More
book,
than
like,
Venice.
More than Venice, Italy.
Yeah.
More than Rotterdam and Venice. More than Amsterdam, right? It's 400 miles of canals, more canals than any other city in the world. And they used to tout that, and now they're like, we don't want to talk about the canals. And they're dead water canals. You can't build a canal and expect a lot of fish in it, A, but you can't build one that's 30 feet deep because there's no seagrass. There's nothing in it. And so they built, entire rivers and rivers of canals to build up the land 5.5 feet above sea level so you can put septic tanks in. And they built the seawalls because waterfront property is more expensive than land, property on land. And so this is what they did. And Cape Coral succeeded. There's a great line that Leonard Rosen, he brings in guys that used to work for the military, building air bases in Iceland, that kind of stuff, hard places, to do it, because it was so hard to do, and they just devastated this environment. I mean, they first of all, to raise the land up meant the trees wouldn't live. The trees couldn't survive, so you would just bulldoze, miles. Cape Coral was bulldozed as far as the eye could see, everything on it. They found artifacts. They found, mastodon bones. They chopped down trees that were, 200 years old. I didn't come into this book as an environmentalist. I came out of it floored at what these people had done. And if you go to Cape Coral today, and some parts are nice, but in general, it has the ambiance of Kazakhstan. It looks like parts of Kansas where you just see as far as the eye can see. It's not very good dirt. It's fill dirt, so stuff doesn't really grow there. They don't need a tree program. They need a tree emergency airlift. You know what I mean?
And the other problem is they were built like a foot above sea level, and now sea level's a lot higher. So they got one of the biggest problems with sea level rise of any place in Florida.
Okay, well, to bring back to the Rosens and your question about scammers, and we talk about the environment, it's fascinating, but the Rosens built Cape Coral, and there's a great line, Leonard Rosen, they've had a long day, and their sun's going down, and they're ready to have a drink, and he gets his car tire stuck in the sand, and they pull his car out. And think of Mad Men, that's the generation, in the suits, and he undoes his tie, and he looks out across Cape Coral, and he's like, you know what? We're going to build this city in spite of ourselves. I never really meant to do this, right? We never really thought this would go. We knew the lot sales would go. We knew our salesmen. They were brutal. Think of Glengarry Glen Ross. Have you ever seen that movie, that stage play of selling land? It's a phenomenal stage play, phenomenal movie. It's these guys selling land in Arizona and New Mexico and cutthroat. That's the way the Rosens were. If you couldn't sell, you were out. You were out. And so Leonard Rosen, the older brother who ran it, was just a piece of work. And he realized that when you sold a home site, 7 years and on installments, you had 7 years to deliver that home site. So even though you made a lot of money, they knew that at Cape Coral at one point they were 100 million in debt. Not in debt, but they had 100 million in improvements owed. Just the roads, the ditches, raising the land up, just the basic. They knew that, and Leonard was like, that's a lot of money, even though we're rich. They almost bought the Miami Dolphins when the NFL franchise came. They had the Gulf American galleries in Miami had the finest artwork in Florida. They had Cezanne's and Van Goghs, and honestly, these were just these two guys from Baltimore. And Leonard decided, well, why are we selling home sites? Because we have to give them something. Why don't we just sell raw acreage? Why don't we come up with a development in which we promise nothing? We promise nothing. A home site, you can eventually build a home there. It has to be ready. By law, it's a felony if you're lying. But because they went out to Eastern Collier Town, Western Collier, way down by the Everglades, and they created Golden Gate Estates, which was they had roads. They dried it out because it was so wet you couldn't get in there. Even in the dry season, you couldn't get in there, and so they built huge canals and roads to nowhere, and they sold it to Northerners. And the salesman lied. None of the materials said you can build here. Matter of fact, the fine print said, we're promising you nothing. Any lawyer would read it and go, why'd you buy this, idiot? But, a mom and dad on a trip across Florida, they went to the Miccosukee Reservation, they did the Indian things, they wrestled with alligators, they did an airboat ride, then they rolled into Golden Gate where they had booths. And, you would go in there and it was like a car salesman, Carvana, but you'd walk in and they bug the booths. And so you go in and the salesman leaves and your wife says, honey, I don't think we should buy this. And, we've got our daughter's wedding coming up. And the guy would come back and go, listen, I know you're worried. And they have information. They would listen to you. They would listen to your conversations. So they would bug. It was the Saturday Evening Post in the 50s. This was big news. And no one really cared. They were just taking Northerners for all they were worth. And so these lots sat for decades and decades and decades, and it was Golden Gate Estates is incredible environmental devastation. One of the saddest stories in Florida that there needs to be specifically a book about it. There's really not one, and I don't know how many thousands of acres. I think it was 55,000 acres.
It was huge. Yeah.
It's south of Alligator Alley.
And the state has stepped in and bought back a lot of those lots and turned it back into the Everglades at our expense.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Lehigh Acres specifically.
Lehigh Acres,
which is like the poster child.
Lehigh Acres is another development, and this one predates Port Charlotte. Lehigh Acres and another one called Harbor Heights. And if anyone from Charlotte County knows, Harbor Heights was low-lying and crazy and full of Florida men. The craziest kids I knew in high school that caused trouble were from there. These were from like 54, 55, really early. And they were the first ones to sell lots. And I think Harbor Heights was $7.50 down, $7.50 a month. Harbor Heights was $10 down, $10 a month. And Lehigh Acres. And Lehigh was maybe 15 miles inland from Fort Myers. And the ads would say, Thomas Edison discovered it. Thomas Edison, wintered in Fort Myers. I wouldn't say vacation.
He had a home there.
He had a home there.
Yeah.
He had an entire lab, just like he had in Menlo Park. He brought it down, and but Lehigh would just lie, and it's scrub brush, man. I mean, that's rattlesnake. That's wild hog country. That's old Florida cowboy country. He just wrote an article on old Florida cowboys, and I mean that's cowboy country. And the man who bought it was Lee Ratner, who sold decon rat poison by mail order.
I love the fact that his name's Ratner.
Ratner. Yeah, and he has a connection to St. Pete. He built Bayway Isles. Is it still called that? Is anyone from here? On Boca Ciega. It's still called Bayway Isles. He built that. He dredged and filled that. I don't know anything about it other than when I wrote about Boca Ciega Bay, and they dredged and filled and almost shut down the whole bay to create these little man-made islands, right? This guy was dangerous. And Lehigh had 135,000 lots. 135,000 lots, right? And in various sizes. But Lehigh, What's fascinating about Lehigh and the demographics of all these places, Port Charlotte has largely remained old. It's largely remained the same after the villages, which is kind of a new outlier. Port Charlotte is I think Charlotte County is still one of the oldest counties, and Port Charlotte's one of the oldest zip codes in America. When I was growing up, Charlotte County was the oldest county in America. I think Tampa was like average age was under 40, mid 30s, and in Port Charlotte it was like 59. People were old, but Lehigh Acres, demographically, I'm 49. I'm not a straight chicken, but people were older demographically, even for Florida. But Lehigh over the years, the same kind of $10 down, $10 a month, but even slower build. It never really took off. Lehigh has now become affordable housing in Fort Myers and Naples. That someone has to clean your pool in these rich developments. Someone has to mow your lawn. Well, where are they going to live? The average house in Collier County is out. In the early 2000s, it was like 300 and something grand. So if you're an immigrant or an illegal or someone who just don't have much money, where are you going to live? And so what they do is they live in Lehigh and then commute to Fort Myers, to Estero, to Collier County. And so you have this failed Port Charlotte-like subdivision sold to retirees that's now become affordable houses, but no downtown, no sidewalks, and we see marijuana grow houses, gang shootings. It's the strangest thing. It's a 50s era, mid-century modern retirement development community that's turned into kind of the Wild West. And there's not the urban structures to support people. There's no bus services. Lehigh has tens of thousands of septic tanks, and it's right along the Caloosahatchee. It's very, very bad for the environment. And so one of the things I should mention is, how do you undo these communities? And what problem? What's the problem with Port Charlotte? What's the problem with Lehigh or Cape Coral? And on the one hand, it's wonderful affordable housing over the years. It's expensive now. It's getting more expensive. But
generations of people moved to Port Charlotte, starting new lives. You know, who am I to say that's a bad thing? My father wandered out of East Pittsburgh. He came down. So who am I to say that in the 80s you shouldn't have done that, or in the 90s? And these places gave them that chance. But when you cookie cutter 200,000 lots
On septic tanks.
with no downtowns, you can't undo
No
that.
schools either, right?
They didn't set aside land for schools. They didn't set aside land for parks. There's no downtowns. And because all of your land is zoned single-family residential, you can't bring in a corporate campus. So what are the jobs going to be? I mean, I can tell you what the jobs in Lehigh Acres are going to be in 50 years because it's not changing. You know, I asked a friend of mine who's the tax assessor, tax collector in Charlotte County, and what if Jeff Bezos would look down from his rocket ship and say, oh my God, Port Charlotte, I want Amazon to move here. I'm bringing in 20 billion. I said, where do you put it? There's 50,000 empty lots, but you can't assemble them into one parcel, right? You can't take up the roads. You can't eminent domain for private purposes. So how do you undo this? You can't. And so they're straitjacketed into a certain type of development, and it's housing and service, right? You can't do anything else in Cape Coral. You can't even build a downtown because there's no core, and so you're missing those properties like in St. Pete or Tampa. Businesses don't use, in general, fire services. They don't use schools. They don't use parks. They pay higher taxes, and that goes for the betterment of the community. What happens when your tax base is resting largely on retirees, fixed income retirees? And so one person described Lehigh Acres during the meltdown as a stucco ghetto, right? A stucco ghetto. And not all of them. Port St. Lucie, people commute to other jobs. It's a bedroom community. Even Spring Hill, I think, has opportunities because people can come to North Tampa. But what do you do, you know, in Lehigh or in Port Charlotte when you're 100 miles from here? You know, there's no urban core to bring up the standard of living, you know, and not that urban cores don't have problems, but this is one of the demographic and, you know, poor planning of the grandfathers visited on the grandsons is really what this book taught me, you know.
One of the things I like about it is at the end you talk about the sort of the consequences of all these poor decisions or lack of oversight and what the result has been for a lot of places.
Yeah, I mean,
this is why we're in the state we're in, you know.
Oh, just the sprawl, you know, from Punta Gorda just going up 10 miles into Port Charlotte, it's like 18 lights. You know what I mean? It's like, it's 45 minutes, you know, and you're not going far, you know. I mean, it's not Dale Mabry, but it kind of is, you know. That's what we're talking about, you know. You ever gone from one end of Dale Mabry to the other? I mean, that's a 2-hour haul or whatever it is, you know. But I mean, that's what that is. Cape Coral has some places like that, and these communities still have lots. So, you know, Tampa doesn't really use the term here, or maybe St. Pete Pinellas because it's so crowded, but most big cities don't use the term at build out. You know, there's room to grow up in Orlando, right? High rises, but Cape Coral knows what build out means. That means every one of these lots has 3.4 people in them. It's a single family home, and we're going to have 475,000 people in the year 2040. Like, they know that. And these communities are you know, Port St. Lucie is going to have 500,000. Cape Coral is going to have 500,000. Port Charlotte's at 60,000, but eventually, with the pressure, that'll be building. Spring Hill will build out. Deltona will build out. I mean, these are some of the biggest future cities in Florida, and they're not really cities. You know, most are unincorporated. Lehigh Acres doesn't have a city government. Port Charlotte doesn't have a city government. It's all county. You know, and so that's one of the problems. You know, the sprawl of it. And Florida will be dealing with that. Another one is water. I learned that in Cape Coral, you build 400 miles of canals. If you think of how water comes out of Florida, it rains heavily in Florida, and it moves slowly in a sheet of water through the Everglades and out the rivers. Well, in the winter, it's dry, so the water's not really pushing at high volume. So the salt water creeps into the brackish harbors, and there's an equilibrium over the year. Well, what happens when the salt water comes in the winter into the canals? It's heavier, so it's never going to leave. And so 400 miles of canals. There's like 300 miles of saltwater canals. They're full of saltwater. And that's going to go into eventually it'll get in the aquifer. There's no way around it. And so these places are bad. 22,000 septic tanks in Lehigh Acres. And there's no state inspection, right? So, I don't want to bring everyone down, but I mean, these communities have repercussions, right? Right?
I'm going to ask you one more question, then we'll throw it open for other questions. So, in touting your book, you went to Cape Coral, right, to give a talk? A, how did that go? And B, did you go by their museum, which is in a trailer?
Well,
and has an exhibit on the Rosen brothers that makes them sound like they're wonderful civic founders.
Well, first of all, I want to say Craig is such a big writer, and he's so helpful, and he's always been helpful to me. This is the second time I met him in person. We've corresponded many times, and he's just so helpful. And anytime I can give him a tidbit of something that he already knows, all the time when I send him something, he already knows it. But I gave him a lead. I'm like, I've been invited to speak at the Cape Coral History Museum, and they're wonderful people, and a wonderful young woman.
Very nice.
Oh.
Yes.
And I was invited to speak at a funeral home. And
so the museum's so small, the funeral home is really kind of the one large space they have for a gathering.
It's really quite neat. I wasn't like, in the funeral home, like, dearly beloved.
But we were the only people who got touted there who actually got to enjoy the ceremony.
Yeah, right. It's a funeral home that has a wonderful community center that's used by the Rotary Club. It's just really nice that they did this. But we're still speaking at a funeral home, and I thought there could be nothing more Florida than this, right?
Yeah. Did you have to move the roses out of the way?
Yeah, right. Yeah. So we spoke there, and they have incredible files and things. They just don't have any support for this. And they have this wonderful woman who's trying to get it going. I didn't see the Rosen exhibit, but
oh yeah,
they gave me pictures and I lectured, and I'm trying not to tell them how bad the history of Cape Coral was. But I walked in, and a woman came up to me, and I mentioned her father in the book. He was the head of world sales, right? And he had a 6th grade education, was a bartender, and Leonard Rosen liked him and hired him. And he had a skill. And she goes, oh yeah, my father did everything. I know. She didn't care at all. And she goes, in fact, when Cape Coral had a fly-and-by program. They would take you up in a Cessna, right on the Del Prado Boulevard. It's one of the big boulevards. They would fly you up, and the pilot would act like he didn't know anything, but he was a salesman. And he would lean out the window, and he had a bag of flour, and he'd go, your lot is right there. And the flour would explode, and that would be your lot. Oh, it wasn't. They didn't know where your lot was.
It was the same lot every time.
It was the same lot.
Yeah.
He just throw a bag out, right?
Yeah.
And she told me, I don't know her name, it's Joe, well, the daughter came up, and she was so nice. And she's like, I was 14, and I would babysit the kids. So the parents could go up, and I knew full well that I would get a piece of the action. And so if I did a good job and the kids were happy and we sold a lot, I'd get a piece. And she was gleeful about it, And another man sat, kind of like this the whole time, and he was a former mayor. And I'm like, oh my God. And afterwards he came up, he's like, oh, it's all true. And politicians in these counties deal with development issues, right? Deal with fixing these problems. The planners, you've interviewed everyone in Florida, but the planners I find to be the great historians of Florida. They know everything. These guys know when things went wrong and when things will go wrong in the future. They know everything. And Cape Coral planners actually held an event called a Platypalooza. And it's that we have no more ideas as to how to undo this grid, this waffle iron we live in. Can you help? They called it a Platypalooza, and it was come public, and they'd come up with ideas like Platypalooza. And I met these guys, and they were great. They were so happy they were in the book, Brilliant guys. Last thing, I know a guy who works for Lehigh Acres. He's a consultant, and he tells them, in 30 years, you're going to have 100,000 more people. You think you might want to buy those last 3 big lots for high schools? And they're like, yeah, whatever. And Best Buy buys them. You know what I mean? Like, if you don't plan ahead with the land, what are you going to do? And some of these kids, like, even as a kid, we played Cape Coral, and they were in the same division as Miami Senior High School because they only had one big high school. Now they have 6 or something, but they were big because they didn't have the land. They had plenty of land, but high school needs 20 acres or whatever, 15 acres, and they didn't have 15 acres. They had one lot,
All right, so who has questions out here? I'm gonna need some help with this because I can't really see too well. Someone in the back, can you speak very loudly? Pine
Yeah.
Island, St. James City.
Yes, I'm sure he knows more about that, but that's old Florida, right? And there's some sections of Pine Island that are still like they were. I haven't been there in years, but I mean, that's a wonderful place. Pine Island is near Cape Coral. That area where Fort Myers Beach is, that was Punta Rasa, and that was where all the cattle in the 1800s were brought to go on barges to Cuba. That's the old Punta Gorda and Punta Rasa were the places where you got the phosphate and the cattle out. Pine Island is just awesome, and some of it's been developed, but in general, it's still a wonderful slice of coastal Florida that you don't see anymore. Oh,
They just got a Publix, she said?
they got a public. Welcome to Florida.
Yeah.
They finally joined the 21st century, Florida. Yeah.
Anyone else?
I'm assuming that Rosen Park is the Rosen brothers?
In Cape Coral?
No, here in
Oh,
St. Petersburg?
I doubt it.
Oh,
I
okay.
doubt it.
Okay.
They weren't connected up here. They were in Miami or in Cape Coral. And the Rosens, one other thing, the Rosens built the Gulf American Corporation at one time for a brief period was the largest corporation in Florida. It had 5,000 workers.
All selling, right?
5,000. They were number 4 for years and years and years, and for a brief period. Then they sold out to a company that stupidly bought it, GAC, General Accounting something, properties, and immediately without the Rosens, without that salesmanship, that fine line between legality and this company just collapsed because they didn't know how to. They thought they were buying a land company. They weren't. They were buying a sales program. Right.
They were buying a boiler room.
A boiler room.
Yeah.
Absolutely a boiler room. Absolutely a boiler room. They all did it. Someone told me that in the book I mentioned there were 2 types of land sellers: those who honor their promises and use high pressure sales tactics, and those who lie and cheat, steal, and use high pressure sales tactics. Right? The Mackles on one side, and Mackles and the Rosens are the 2 sides of the book. The two, and they hated each other.
Where do you live now?
I didn't hear that.
Where do you live now?
I live in Fort Worth, Texas. My wife's a professor at Texas Christian University. She is a big endowed chair, studies women in the military, and I'm a stay-at-home dad and a writer. I used to be professor at a small college, but when she got this job and we have little kids, forget it. And I get them to school and I write. That's all I do. So.
This is a big outing for him.
Yes. Yeah, you don't know.
So my question is, at the end of the book, you talk about a developer, I think Kipson and Babcock Ranch.
Yes.
So what has become of that?
Oh man, stories, books will fall into your lap. I don't know how, Craig, we talk about writing, but sometimes you start a book and you don't know how it's going to end. It's not like you know everything and everything you're going to put down when you started, and it just fell into my lap. Right now, at the out back end of Charlotte County was one of Florida's last great ranches, Babcock Ranch. It was 90,000 acres. 90,000 acres owned by the son of a timber magnate, former mayor of Pittsburgh. It was E.V. Babcock and his son Babcock. And powerful, rich people. And this guy loved Florida. He loved old Florida. And he kept this ranch running, and they had at least 1, if not 2 full-time posses. These were cowboys to the very end. And he died, and the family wanted to chop it up. And it was a big fight over how they were going to do it, how much the state was going to get or try to get. They should have got all of it. But they came up with a deal where 25,000 acres would become a city, a brand new community called Babcock Ranch. And the other 65,000 acres or whatever would become state property. And it is now, which is kind of a win.
2 things. One, it's supposed to be America's first solar-powered city.
Mhm.
So they put in lots of solar power there. But second, they kept the ranch operating on the state property.
Whoa.
As like a tour thing, like an
Yeah.
eco tour thing. And so I guess sometimes the tour buses pull up and the cattle try and get in.
I thought about,
I probably wouldn't do it, but I thought about a book called The Ranch, and it would just be the history of the Babcock Ranch related to Florida, like Florida's frontier, that moving into the 21st century. But Babcock, I drove out there recently. I was down for a tour a couple months ago when I went to the funeral home, and I shot out there. It's right near for those of you who don't know, it's right by the Lee County Civic Center. It's in North Fort Myers, going east by LaBelle, by the Caloosahatchee, and I drove around there, and they're going gangbusters. And these are moderately priced homes, but it's new urbanist. Have you been to old Hyde Park Village? You know, trying to bring walkability, trying to build houses close to paths so you have to interact with your neighbor. You can't just pull in, set back from the road, and go to sleep watching The Office. You know what I mean? You have to interact. They try to bring everything to the center of a town. They even called it the anti-Port Charlotte, right? But I find it fascinating. You know, at one end of the county, the center of the county, you have a ranch. Northerners redeveloping this ranch to sell to Northerners. Now you have, 70 years later, another ranch purchased by a Northerner to redevelop to sell to Northerners generally. And it's just fascinating. You know, I wonder when Florida's going to run out of land. I mean, how many ranches are left? But in the book, I use a quote, and I just love this. Someone said, "We got to be careful with this. This is the last of the best of Florida." And at least they got this big chunk of property out. There was a chance they could have got all of it, and they didn't, and there's more to that story. But at least it'll never be developed. So
We have time for two more.
I understand you to say that the state should have gotten Babcock Ranch. Why should they have gotten it if it was privately held, family-owned ranch?
yeah, it was. I don't know the whole story. There was a chance that the state could have purchased it. You might know this better than me.
Okay, they purchased it, they did.
Yes, and it
No,
was,
they weren't going to do eminent domain.
Okay.
No. They were going to purchase it, and it was a lot of money, and I think it would have gone. From what I read, they had to get 2 different appraisals, independent, and the family would accept the middle. I don't know much more than this, what I'm telling you. And the family said they would accept it, and it was like $400 million, something like that. And I don't know the ins and outs of Tallahassee. I don't follow politics, but it was torpedoed. Someone didn't want it to happen because they wanted development to happen. This was under the Bush.
And the developer was Sid Kitson, who's a former Pittsburgh Steeler.
Yeah.
So we're bringing it back around to Pittsburgh again.
Yeah, and the developer swooped in, and so he did. From what I see from the outside, it's not bad compared to what it could be, right? What it could be is a mess, and it looks, you know, maybe in 50 years we'll have someone like me making fun of it and writing about it, but it's not bad. It looks nice.
It
looks
could be
like-
worse, is what you're saying.
It could be worse. I wouldn't live there, but
That's
it
our
looks
state
nice.
slogan, you know. Florida, it could be worse. You have any other questions? Yes.
I remember as a little girl, I know Jason, growing up in Punta Gorda, we used to go to Rotunda West.
Oh, God,
Can
my
you
favorite
talk-
subject.
Can you talk about Rotunda West?
Yes.
Lee Majors, just quickly.
Lee Majors.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing up
As a
Rotunda
third
West.
grader, I remember that well.
Yes.
Okay, there was a salesman from Pittsburgh, a skinny, small guy who was really good looking, and there was a St. Petersburg Times writer that I love. She passed away a while ago, Elizabeth Whitney. And she was a single mom, became an editor, really fascinating woman, tough, but pretty. And she wrote in the article several times, she liked this guy. You could see it. She liked to interview this guy. She had hots for him. And he was a TV salesman from Pittsburgh who was so good at selling, he went to Florida and started selling independently for the Rosens, selling land. And he sold so much land that I think it was John D. MacArthur, one of the big land guys, rich, wealthy men, owned Palm Beach, but inland from Palm Beach. And he said, you give me the land, you give me a catalog of lots, I'll sell this land for you. And he started selling it and promising, it was raw acreage, but promising a city of the future. And from the sky, it was a circular city. It looked like Trivial Pursuit. Remember the Trivial Pursuit pie? It looked like that. So there were 8 pieces of the pie, 8 golf courses, and all of the with a spinning Seattle sky needle in the middle, in a restaurant. And then you could get in your boat and go around the circle and then to the Okeechobee Waterway, and you could go to Lake Okeechobee and to the Caloosahatchee and to the Gulf, or you could go to the Atlantic. So that was the selling point of a city that could never be built, on raw acreage that they were lying about. And so Palm Beach County said, get out of here. You're not building this. So
And that was Rotunda East.
Rotunda East.
Yes.
So he went to Charlotte County where he bought 15,000 acres from the Vanderbilt brothers, who had bought land near Cape Hayes, near Inglewood, El Jabin on the water, south of Venice. And Charlotte was like, sure, build whatever you want. Sure, whatever. And they built this half-ass development that became Rotunda West. And when we were kids, I wasn't born yet, but in my town they did, what was it called? The stars competition.
Oh, yeah.
Like Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier and Jackie Stewart and, you know what I mean, a random
Like Dancing with the Stars, but with sports competition.
sports competition.
Yes.
We're gonna have bowling, and you'd have Muhammad Ali bowling, and you know all these random people. And Rotunda sponsored it, and my town went nuts. I mean, Johnny Bench is coming to Port Charlotte, right? and these guys came, and of course there's nothing there, and they hated it. But they did it for several years until Rotunda West went under, and so today you look. Go to Google Earth. There's a round pie right in the middle of what northwestern Port Charlotte, northwestern Charlotte County.
And the deal was you were supposed to be able to play a different golf course for every day of the week. So they would have 7 of them, except they didn't get out of the weekend. They only built 2 of them.
Yeah. They had to admit publicly. The Federal Trade Commission forced them to admit, and I mentioned in the intro, that these lots were not viable as home sites and not good investments.
Well,
they had to come out and say it.
And you couldn't actually get to the Gulf from there either.
Oh, and the maps, you look at the St. Petersburg Times had this great, wonderful view of the future. You know, it says all amenities not presently pictured are you know, like this crap. But then you look, and sure enough, you see a straight river right out to the Gulf. And there's no way all that salt water would just ruin the wetlands, ruin the, you know, you can't let salt water come up where it shouldn't be. And these guys didn't care. The guy who designed it had never designed even a house. He just designed it like on a napkin. You know, it's just silly. But they built it, or they tried to build it, and it's finally filling out. But through the 70s, Rotunda, perfect place to dump a body. You know what I mean? Like, that's what they were. You know, and so anyway.
Thanks very much for coming tonight. We appreciate it. And Jason, we have a special round of applause for Jason. He will be signing books over there, I think.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you all so much for being here. Please grab a book from the bookstore if you haven't already. We have Jason's books, Craig's books, lots of other books too.